Everybody. I hope that you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on dashes. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts. Grade 7. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of dashes. All right. So our chapter is dashes. Our subject is English Language Arts. Grade 7. And then the lessons that we are going to be focusing on is to use dashes. All right. So a dash, it often represents a pause in a sentence, right? So a dash is like a little, like a little line, like we would say, right? And it often represents a pause within a sentence. So, as much as we would say that a comma represents a pause, a comma is mainly just for you not to have run on words, and just for you to take a little break, right? But not an actual pause, right? So, a dash is there to bring about a pause, and it's also like to show a clear break between maybe two sentences or between certain words. All right. So a dash can show a clear break or set off extra content from the rest of the sentence, right? So, for example, it's something like an aside, right? Or an explanation, or it's like adding additional information or additional details to a specific sentence, right? So we can then basically say within a certain sentence that a dash would show a clear break, if that is now our clear and logical explanation, right? So other than it representing a pause, it needs to show a clear break between either two words, two sentences, or to basically show additional or extra information. So, according to, if we look at specific sentences, right, or let's say before we go to um, an example of what dashes are, right? Firstly, we say dash it represents or it often represents a pause, right? Within a sentence, pause between, we can even say between sentences or a pause between words, right? A dash can also show a clear break, right? The same as a like a pause, or it will basically just show a clear break, or we would say it will basically set off um, content from the rest of the sentence, right? So when we set off extra information or extra content from the rest of the sentence, then it would be like as something that you just put a say on the side or aside. It would have an extra explanation to something, or it will have additional details that you would basically add to the sentence that you already basically have written, right? And once again, we would say that a dash, it shows a clear break. So if we look at, an example of dashes, right? So we are going to see if a dash either shows a clear break, right? Or if a dash is set off as an aside, right? And when we say it's as an aside, right? The word as an aside, then it means that it either shows an extra explanation or it shows additional details, right? All right. So by looking at the first example, it says, according to legend, King Midas. So according to legend, King Midas ultimately died of starvation, all because of his wish that everything he touched should turn gold, right? So if we look at that specific sentence, right, then we would basically see this dash that we have over there as, remember, we see that a dash either represents a clear break or it can be set off with extra content, right, from the rest of the sentence, such as an aside, right? So in this case, if we look at that sentence, it says, according to legend, King Midas ultimately died of starvation, all because of his wish that everything he touched should turn gold, which means that we only took this dash. It basically only shows a clear break, right? It shows a pause, shows a clear break, right? That's it. Whereas, and especially if you look at that specific sentence, right, with the dash literally in the middle of that sentence, right, it doesn't show any form of extra explanation or any other details of that specific sentence, right? It basically just tells us why he died of salvation. And it means that he died of salvation because he thought that everything that he touches should turn to gold, right? Which means that it includes food, it includes water, right? Anything that he thought that he would touch would turn into gold. So that is why he died of salvation. There was no extra explanation as into explaining like I just did, right? Then if you look at the next one, right? So remember we need to say if it represents a clear break, if it shows a clear break, or if it's set off by extra content such as an aside, which means that it is either an additional explanation or an additional details of that specific sentence, right? The next one says, Warren strives to control every aspect of his life. So Warren strives to control every aspect of his life, but life, surprise, surprise, doesn't always accommodate his wishes, right? So we can say Warren strives to control every aspect of his life, but life, surprise, surprise, doesn't always accommodate his wishes. So which means that these words, especially these words, surprise, surprise, right? Those are set off as an aside, right, from the rest of the sentence. Because remember, we could have just said Warren strives to control every aspect of his life, but life doesn't always accommodate his wishes. Yet, an additional information that was added or additional details that was added to that specific sentence is surprise, surprise. So, which means that the dashes over here, right, it is set off as an aside from the rest of the sentence. So which means that surprise, surprise is set off um, as an extra from the rest of the sentence, right? So we need to know the difference between when we are taking a clear break or when it shows a clear break within a sentence or when it is set off or when it sets off extra content or extra information from the rest of the sentence. And when we say it sets off extra content from the rest of the sentence, then we can call that a or an aside, right? And an aside is an explanation or it's an additional details or something's just to bring about more or something extra to the sentence. Because remember when we either write a sentence or we write something or we're making mention of something, then it means that you need to describe something in a manner in which the reader should be more intrigued to want to read more. All right. So that is also by giving additional information. All right. So now we're going to a plus students.ca. And we're going to continue with our lesson on dashes, right? So we said our chapter is dashes, and the lesson that we are focusing on will be using dashes. And remember, we said that we will either show that we use dashes based on it showing a clear break, or we need to identify or use or show how dashes are used by either a set aside, right? Whether it is an additional or it shows an additional um, information, additional description, it shows additional details, or it shows an explanation, right, to the rest of the sentence. All right, so once again, just to go over it again, we said a dash often represents a pause in a sentence, and it can show either a clear break or set of extra content or extra information from the rest of the sentence, right? Such as an aside. So the word is an aside, which shows an explanation or gives additional details, right? And then we made an example of King Midas, where we say that according to King Midas, according to legend, King Midas ultimately died of starvation. Pause. All because of his wish that everything he touches should turn gold, right? Which means that the dash over here, right, it basically just shows a clear break, right? No additional information, right? The additional information is usually given to show why he didn't specifically or let's say the reasons for him not eating anything, right? And that was examples that I made earlier on where I said that I'm sure that he died of starvation because he thought if he were to touch food, if he were to touch water, then automatically it was supposed to have turned gold, which means that it did not, right? If we look at the second one, Warren strives to control every aspect of his life, but life, surprise, surprise, doesn't always accommodate his wishes, right? And if we look at that sentence, right, then our dashes over here, this dash as well as this one, it is basically a set aside and additional information is given, right? So surprise, surprise is basically set off as an aside from the rest of the sentence because we could have just written the sentence with Warren strives to control every aspect of his life, but life doesn't always accommodate his wishes. But yet, in the sentence, they've added surprise, surprise, right? So, which means that that is an aside from the rest of the sentence, right? It is something that was just added or something additional, right? And additional details to that specific sentence, right? So, we would say that that dash or the dashes over there, it sets off and aside from the rest of the sentence. All right, the next one says certain quakes repeatedly washing one's hands, checking that doors are locked, or counting things may actually be symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So if we look at that sentence, right, it says certain quirks, repeatedly washing one's hands, checking that doors are locked, or counting things may actually be symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So if we look, there's two dashes within that sentence, right? And it basically is we can say that those dashes, it sets of additional information that is given, right? Because if we were just to read the sentence, right, without the additional information, we would say certain quakes may actually be symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? But yet we are giving a description or additional information that may add to what or why we might say that it is obsessive compulsive disorder. And the additional information that is given that sets it aside from the rest of the sentence is repeatedly washing one's hands, checking that doors are locked, or counting things, right? Those are, or that is basically an additional information that is given, right? So that sets it off from the rest of the sentence. All right. Then it also says in dialogue, right? Or quoted text. So remember, dialogue is a conversation between two or more people, right? Or quoted text, right? A dash can indicate an interruption or it can indicate mid sentence correction, right? So within a dialogue, which is a conversation, or quoted text, right? Usually quoted text, it's either something that you directly took from something that someone had already said, or usually conversation, something that someone says directly is basically quoted, right? So if you basically want to repeat what I said, right, you'll basically put it in your own words. But as soon as you want to say what I said word for word, then you need to quote what I said because it is not your own words, right? So that is why they say in dialogue or quoted text, a dash can indicate an interruption or a mid sentence correction. For example, Laura protested, but no, you're mistaken, right? So, firstly, this is what Laura directly said, right? Because it's a quoted text. And if we look at the dash, right, and where the dash is placed, it says, but no, you are mistaken, right? Which basically shows an interruption, right? So we can insert a dash before Friday, right? So we will go on to the next activities, right? Where we are going to first look at activities and then we will try to figure out if the dash either represents what type of pause the dash represents. Is it a dash that shows a clear break, or is it a dash that shows of extra content or extra information from the rest of the sentence, right? And remember, we see that a dash that is set off with extra content or information and it sets it off from the rest of the sentence, we call that an aside, right? And an aside is either an explanation or an aside is any additional details that is added to that sentence, right? So even if you were to remove those details from the sentence will still be complete. And then when you either write a dialogue or within a dialogue or within a quoted text, right? A dash can indicate an interruption or it can indicate a mid sentence correction, right? All right. Yeah, they're saying insert a dash before fried dumplings. Before fried dumplings are extremely popular, and that is to indicate a clear break, right? So now, if we look at our activity or we look at that sentence, remember we said that a dash it indicates or shows a clear break, right? Or it can be set off by an aside where we either add an additional information or let's say an explanation, right? All right, so it says if you ever visit Shanghai, right? So if you ever visit Shanghai, be sure to sample some of the street food. Fried dumplings are extremely popular. So if you ever visit Shanghai, be sure to sample some of the street food. Fried dumplings are extremely popular, right? So if we specifically look at that sentence, then we can say that this dash over here, it basically indicates or it shows a clear break, right? Shows a break between that sentences because it basically just continues. So it just takes a pause. It just takes a little pause and then it continues, right? Because they're basically just telling you what you need to try once you visit Shanghai, the popular things, right? All right, so look at the next one. This one. It says Johannesburg. Johannesburg, South Africa's largest city and the seat of its constitutional court, has served as the home for such luminaries as Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, right? So if we look at that sentence, and that sentence specifically has two dashes, right? Firstly, they're speaking about Johannesburg, right? And they're specifically telling us that Johannesburg is it's one of the largest cities within South Africa, and it has served as the home for such luminaries as Desmond Tutu as well as Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela is our former, because I'm from South Africa, so Nelson Mandela is our former president, but we can also say he is our very first black president within South Africa. And before I even go to Desmond Tutu, if we look at the word luminaries, right? Luminaries means it is either a person who has great influence, or we can say it is somebody or person who inspires others. So somebody with great influence or influence inspires others, right? Um, Within different spheres of life. It depends. But I think what's most important is that luminaries means that it is a person who either inspires others or influences others, right? That is luminaries. So we see that Nelson Mandela is our former president, and also our very first black president of South Africa. And then we also have Desmond Tutu, right? He is also very well respected, right? um, or was, and he was our archbishop, right? If that, yeah, he was the archbishop of basically of South Africa. So both basically Nelson Mandela as well as Desmond Tutu, they fought for the rights of people in South Africa to be free, right? Since we can call it a war, but it wasn't war, it was apartheid, right? Where there were separations. All right. So that is luminaries, right? So if we specifically look at that sentence, it says Johannesburg, there's a dash, South Africa's largest cities, and the seat of its constitutional court, dash, has served as the home for such luminaries as Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, right? And if we look at the word, if we look at the two dashes, right? Firstly, Johannesburg, if we were to remove South Africa's largest city and the seat of constitutional court, if we were to remove that whole sentence, right, then we can just say South Africa has served as the home for such luminaries as Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. That would be a sentence on its own, right? This that I have put in a little rectangle or circled, right? South Africa's largest city and the seat of its constitutional court, it is basically something extra. So, which means that the dashes that we have over here, right? We can say that it is set off with additional details or additional information, and it basically sets it off from the rest of the sentence. It is additional information that is basically added to the details of or the sentence of Johannesburg as the home of Nelson Mandela as well as Desmond Tutu. All right. If we look at the next one, right? If we look at another example, it says the art festival features face painting, food vendors, live music, oh, and fireworks, Paula said, right? So if we specifically look at that sentence, remember we said that a dash it shows a clear break, or a dash can can be set off either by additional information, or a dash can be set off by um, it can be set off by any explanation, right? And that can be an aside. But also, if it is used within dialogue or within a quoted text, remember we said dialogue or quoted text is what somebody says, right? It is basically the words that somebody says. And I made an example where I said that if you want to tell somebody what I said, right, by putting it in your own words, then you don't need to quote the text. But as soon as you directly say what I have said, then it means that you need to quote what I have said. So now it's like saying, instead of saying, um, whatever, but now you're saying said Nadine or Nadine says or so on, right? Then it means that you're directly saying what I had said, right? So which means that dialogues can either shows it indicates an interruption, or dialogue can show a mid-sentence correction, right? And we say that the art festival features face painting, food vendors, live music, oh, and fireworks, said Polar, right? Polar said. So if we look at the dash within that sentence, right? The dash over here within that sentence, it shows or indicates an interruption, right? Within that sentence, because they are saying that the art vessel features face painting, food vendors, live music, right? So we could have just stopped there, but now they're interrupting by also saying, oh, and fireworks, right? So the oh within that sentence, especially, it shows an interruption. So the dash shows the O shows the interruption because they want to add the word fireworks to it, right? All right. So now we're going to a+students.ca, and we're going to do our test, right? All right. So we need to insert one dash, right? All right. So it says the trade union's president was voted into office by a resounding majority, at least that's the story they gave, right? Or is it option two, where we say that the trade union's president was voted into office by the resounding majority, at least that's the story they gave. So we need to specifically look at the dash and we need to see where the break was or where the pause was taken, right? So basically the dash needs to be on or at the correct place to in order to show where the break was, where the additional information was given, right? And if we were to show the correct break or where the break was or were to be specifically, then we will go with option one because it says trade unions president was voted into office by a resounding majority. At least that's the story they gave. So which means that they took a break and then at least that's the story they gave. All right, so now we're going to insert another dash where needed, right? Remember the dash shows a clear break, right? Usually if we have two dashes, then in between the two dashes, we will show either an additional explanation or additional information, or we will see additional details of whatever that was added within the sentence, right? So even if the additional information wasn't in the sentence, then that sentence will still be complete. All right, so it says salmon hatch in fresh water and migrate to the ocean, though they eventually return to fresh water to spawn and die, right? That is option one. Or we have option two, where it says salmon hatch in fresh water and migrate to the ocean, though they eventually return to fresh water to spawn and die. So we need to say which option is correct, where the dash is correctly placed, or where a dash is correctly needed. All right, so if we were to choose the correct option, right, we would say salmon hatch in fresh water migrate to the ocean, pause, though they eventually return to fresh water to spawn and die. So option one is our correct option. All right, let's do the last one. It says we need to insert one dash where needed, right? Remember, we said a dash shows a clear break. It says Miss Kirk studied both business and fine arts in college, a combination that makes sense to both who know her as the owner of a highly successful art supply store. Or is it option two, where we can say Miss Kirk studied both business and fine arts in college, a combination that makes sense to those who know her as the owner of a highly successful art supply store. So if we were to choose the correct option, then we would go with option two, right? Because there it also shows a clear break, right? All right, so that is now the end of our lesson on dashes. Remember, we said that dashes either shows a clear break within a sentence or it can basically show where it is set off by a set aside, right, or a side, which is either an explanation or additional details of a specific sentence or additional information of a sentence. Or if within a dialogue or within a conversation, right, or within quoted text, right, a dialogue can either show an interruption or something missing within a sentence. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on dashes. Thank you very much for joining the class. Till next time.